In this video, we're going to start creating some pixel art. And we're just going to be creating a basic background and some simple assets that we can bring into our game engine for our 2D side-scroller game. Now, I'm going to be using Photoshop. If you're using a different image editing software, that's okay. This workflow should work just fine for that as well. So the first thing I want to do is create a new document. I'm going to set my width and height to 16 by 16 pixels. And this is essentially what we're going to be doing for our tile size that we're going to be replicating across our canvas to create bigger images. Now, you can use a bigger tile size, but I feel like 16 by 16 is a good starting point. And again, we're going to be kind of adding these together to create bigger images anyways. And then I'm going to have 8-bit color since I'm working in pixels. You could probably use up to 16, but 32 is probably going to be overkill. Now, I'm just going to use a basic gray mid-tone background so I can actually see my grid on top of that, and then have my pixel aspect ratio as square. Now, when we first start, it's going to be zoomed out. And so we're going to want to zoom in on that until we can actually see our pixel grid. Now, by default, usually Photoshop will start you off with this brush tool. And what we actually want to do is we want to switch over to the pencil tool, and we want to set the size down to 1 and increase the hardness up to 0. And then we want to set the same thing for our eraser and make sure that's flipped over to pencil mode as well. Now, the first thing I like to create is my character, and this is just going to be a basic sizing tool so we know kind of what the rest of the level is going to look like in relation to how big our character is. So I'll create another layer, and we're going to call this character. And that way we know that the background for the character is transparent. And then you could start building out your character this way, but I like to increase it a little bit taller and kind of cheat it by having another tile on top of this and making it 32 pixels high. So what I'll do is I'll go to image, and then I'll go to canvas, and I'll set the height to 32. Just keep it as a simple silhouette for now. We're just going to be using it as a measuring device, and we'll be building upon character design a little bit later in a different video. But using a simple silhouette that's strong for your character will only make it more powerful as you're kind of adding more details to it. So let's make our canvas a little bit bigger to incorporate our background. And I'm going to go to image, canvas size, and my size I'm going to use is 320 by 180. And that's based off of our standard 16 by 9 aspect ratio. Although older style pixel games usually use a square format, and you might still want to do that depending on the platform you're building out to. But most of mine is going to be for a modern screen, so I'm doing 320 by 180. So I'll get and zoom out so you can see this a little bit better. And you notice I have this grid on here. So you need to implement that as well. We'll go to Edit, and we'll go to Preferences and General. The first thing you want to do is you want to change your image interpolation to nearest neighbor. It might be set to bicubic, and we don't want it to be smooth. Again, we're working in pixels, so we want these hard edges to be nice and crisp. So to get the grid set up, you're going to go down to Guides and Grid, and then you're going to set it to 16. And I'm just setting mine to a basic gray color and setting my subdivisions to 1. And I'll typically cycle my grid on and off depending on what I'm working on. Let's move my character down a little bit lower. So for a platformer, kind of think about, okay, where is this taking place? Is it going to be inside or outside? Is it going to be crawling down or up? And kind of position your character accordingly. And then typically you're going to be standing on some kind of platform or block. Since I'm going to be kind of climbing up in my platformer or my side scroller and leaving most of my areas going to be sky, I'll kind of keep my character down below. So the first thing we want to think about is our layers. And our first layer is going to be our sky. And like kind of separating this into layers is going to allow us to kind of work more efficiently, copy and paste things, and kind of essentially start placing out our scene in a more efficient manner. So I'll name my first one Sky, since my character is going to be seeing majority of its sky. And compositionally, how we want to lay this out is consider the rules of 3. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to split up my composition of my sky in half, where I'm only seeing half of maybe sky, and then the bottom's going to be floor, because that's kind of visually unappealing. So really what I want to think about is taking majority of my space is going to be sky. And then I could probably add some clouds, and then I'm going to be layering some other stuff on top of that. So what I think about is I want to have a background, a foreground, and a midground, somewhere in the middle. And if I have these in different layers, this will allow us to achieve effect known as parallax. And if you've ever driven in a car, you notice that things further away move at different speeds. So mountains off in the distance move a lot slower than, maybe a fence post that's right next to your car as you're kind of driving past. And if you kind of layer this up and kind of move stuff accordingly in your game, it'll add a little bit more depth. And then I'm going to go ahead and create another layer. I'll have one for maybe, we'll call this one midground. And then a lot of my foreground elements will be considered really stuff that I'll be using for what's considered a tile map. So on this scene, I have the basic elements that we talked about. I'll take the grid off real quick so you can kind of see it a little bit better. And I have my background, which is my clouds and my sky, which again, will probably move a lot more slowly than these mountains that are kind of in the foreground. And then I also have this brown stuff. And, for most side scrollers and platformers, you probably don't even want to see this background type brown. And think about your viewpoint as just kind of, more flat, that you're looking at this straight on. And you'd probably just see maybe some of these background mountains or elements. And the trick to a good background is keeping it really simple. The more busy you get this, it's going to look really confusing for your eye because stuff in the background tends to get a little bit more blurry and out of focus anyways. Like you notice these mountains back here like have less and less detail, and that's kind of like this layering effect. So if I were to like detail out everything, it's going to be kind of confusing and it's not going to look very realistic. And then it's also going to draw attention away from the important stuff, which is my character and some of my more important game elements. So the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to check to make sure that this is actually something that we can repeat. Now, for the most part, we would probably want to change up these mountains a little bit. Maybe the clouds we can kind of have as separate objects and move around and change. But to kind of speed things up, I'm just copying this whole background, and then I'm going to kind of expand this to kind of show you how I can kind of tile this out. So if I go to image, and I'm going to increase my canvas width 320 in both directions. So now I can essentially just copy and paste my background, and I can check to make sure that this is a tileable image, and it can actually repeat and stretch across in both directions. And again, if I had too much detail in this background, it would be really obvious. And already some of these key details you can kind of see where I might even have them as separate objects, such as these mountains that kind of repeat. So I can kind of change it up a little bit and make it a little bit more ambiguous. So the next thing we're going to look at is our tile palette. And this is what we're going to be really working with mostly in our game engine. So don't get too carried away as like building it out. But a tile palette is a series of these foreground objects that we can kind of use to repeat and reuse over again, kind of speed up our workflow. Now, the first ones I start off with is these just ground type objects. And you notice I've kind of exploded this one on the right just to kind of see how they separate. But if I show you on my grid, on this one on the left, you can kind of see how I've broken this up accordingly, where every one kind of takes up a 16 by 16 tile. And then I kind of show you how these separate. And in practice, what this will allow me to do is I will be able to copy and paste. And again, don't get too carried away with this in the beginning, because we're going to be actually bringing this over to a game engine to really start tiling this out. But for now, it'll kind of help you just to visualize actually how everything's going to be flowing together. And if your tile palette's actually going to be something that can work into a seamless tile map. Make sure you're doing all this level design work on a separate layer so you're not messing up your tile map, because you want to keep that separate and safe. So one of the first things when you're creating a platformer game is platforms and stuff that allows your character to jump on or jump across. And the opposite of that is a pit. Well, it allows your character to fall if they don't make the jump, and the player might have to restart or they lose health. And then you can also switch up, maybe the color of the grass or make it have no grass. And then you can have areas where your platforms go up to kind of break up the rhythm and have your character. So after I got a lot of my ground tiles built out, the next thing I want to do is start building out the rest of my tile palette. And I start just thinking about other things that'll go, within my theme of this desert and different stuff that goes on the ground. One of the big things that would come next after your platform would be some kind of like spike. And the thing I thought about that would work for this was a cactus. And you can kind of see some of my workflow or my thought pattern is I'm kind of experimenting with like, different looks of the cactus, and I'm wanting something that looks a little bit more dangerous, that some character want to avoid. Then I have other objects that are more passive that don't really have any spikes or anything like that, that maybe you can kind of pass by and walk past. And you kind of thinking about other stuff that would kind of go and kind of fill out your theme, such as trees and bushes and their plant matter. And things to think about when I'm creating these objects is I'm using at least, three different tones, kind of like a dark, a mid-tone, and a highlight. And sometimes I'll add, four. And thinking about the rhythm that this is creating, it's hard sometimes to focus on that in the beginning, especially when you're zoomed in. So always take breaks and kind of zoom out, especially like away from the grid and kind of see what, these shapes are actually looking like when your player is going to be playing the game. And then stuff that's, here in the foreground, I tend to throw a black outline across to kind of separate a little bit more from the background. And it kind of showcases stuff that the player could actually interact with as well. So we're going to be using a game engine to actually use these tiles and build out our level. So don't spend too much time in the level design here, but it's a good idea to, just to see how everything's going to be in place. Spend most of your time actually building out these tiles and your objects that are going in your game. And we'll take a look at it a little bit more and build out a little bit more throughout these tutorials, is really start doing some research and thinking about, what might go in your level and what players might do with it. And this is where some of your themes and your visual elements will start even affecting some of the mechanics and how you kind of, start building out your game itself. Do some research, look up real reference, look up pixel reference, play some pixel games and kind of take some notes. So you're not totally like, ripping off the stuff, but you're actually knowledgeable about, what's out there, what's been done. One of the best quotes is that I could see further because I sit on the shoulders of giants. So you can see what works, what doesn't work, and kind of build off of that. You create something unique and new.
Now let's look how to save this. And we're saving this just as standalone image. It's going to be a little bit different for how we want to save it for like a game. I'm going to go to File. I'm going to export this and go to Export As because it gives you more control over it. And I'm going to export it as a PNG because it has less compression problems like a JPEG. And then I'm going to make sure that this is switched from bicubic to nearest neighbor so we keep this pixel edges. And if this was, exporting out to just a game, I would probably keep the scale at 100. But since we want to just be able to share this and view this just as an image, I'll probably create this to like 500 or 600%. And then go ahead and export this file.